is a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. Her research interests include the development of democracy and dictatorship, European politics, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She is author of books on European social democracy and the fate of democracy during the interwar years, social democracy and fascism in 19th and 20th century Europe, and her latest book, which is will be out soon, right, I hope. I pre-ordered it, you can too, is Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Regime to the Present Age, is forthcoming from Oxford Community Press. In addition to her scholarly work, she's also published a wide variety of non-scholarly publications, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs. I'm not going to list all of that. She also runs an animal rescue organization, which will be our shared charity later, and she lives in my neighborhood in Park Slope. So welcome, Sheri, come on up. So, there's been a lot happening lately in terms of democracy, and illiberalism is sort of like not liberalism. And I wonder if you could explain, sort of unpack that for us, because that's a word, a term that we've been hearing a lot of. And I'm not sure if we're all familiar with what that means and the ways in which it's being bandied about. So please start with that, unpack that word for us.
Okay, great. So we hear these terms liberal and illiberal and democratic and undemocratic, and they're not actually the same thing. We think of liberal democracy, I think, in the United States as a sort of thing that's natural, that the liberalism and the democracy go together. But in fact, historically, they've not gone together, either in the United States or in Europe. So what does that mean? Well, democracy is about elections. Democracy is about majority rule. Democracy is about the people getting to choose their government. But democracy says really nothing about what that government should do. It says nothing about limits on the majority. It says nothing about anything else other than that the principle of government is that the people get to pick it. The people get to pick their leaders. Liberalism, on the other hand, is something very different. Liberalism is about limiting power. It's about the rights of individuals, and it's about the rights of minorities. And those two things actually historically have not gone together very easily. And so what I think we're seeing a little bit today, particularly in the United States and in Western Europe, is a questioning, particularly of the liberalism part, and an assertion actually that democracy has been undermined in some way, is not functioning very well, and that actually the rule of the majority should be allowed to determine all kinds of things. In other parts of the world, actually people are questioning both, even whether or not democracy is the right system of rules. So I noticed, for instance, that in your brochure that you have for today, at the very bottom of one of the inside pages, there's a quote by perhaps the man in Europe who has been the most forceful advocate of another kind of political system, Viktor Orban, who's the current head of Hungary, who said the era of liberal democracy is over. The idea of liberalism in particular, he doesn't like. He doesn't like the idea that individuals should be protected over the group, that minorities should be protected when the majority decides something different, and that there should be limits, again, on what leaders and governments should be able to do as long as they have, again, achieved their power through elections. So it's a kind of interesting time, I think, when particularly the questions around liberalism are being discussed once again, and even again, how far or the nature of or the extent of democracy.
So in the book that's coming out, you refer to, you say at the end of the 20th century, we saw many democracies, and that now in the 21st century, we see a lot of backsliding, that there's been a lot of pessimism, a lot of backsliding. And you mentioned Hungary, for example, he's somebody who has really spoken out against George Soros, and George Soros has been kind of a lightning rod for the right wing here in this country as well. How dangerous do you think that is? Is this something that we need to be alarmed about?
So absolutely. I mean, again, if we think back on our own history, things like the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, those things were put in place to limit the power of leaders and governments on the theory that unchecked power was really potentially dangerous, even if that power came from a majority vote. So what people like Orban are saying is, look, we don't believe in those kinds of things. We don't believe that there should be limits on authority. We believe that if the leader, as the personification of the people, decides to limit freedom of the press, limit the rights of minorities, engage in xenophobic or prejudicial actions or statements, that as long as the people are behind him or the government, that that's okay. And I think, again, what this makes us realize is that as important as democracy is, that if it's not paired with something like liberalism, it can also be very dangerous.
So I'm wondering, so we're talking about people who say, well, if the majority is behind me, that's okay. And they don't pay attention to the minority. So would you say that liberalism sort of supports, part of the role of liberalism is to support a minority view and make sure that a minority voice is heard?
Well, it's supposed to protect individuals, right? And it's particularly supposed to protect individuals who may often fall outside, again, of the boundaries of whatever majority is the majority of the day, right? The idea is that individuals have rights that are self-evident, that are inalienable. That means cannot or should not be taken away, regardless of what, again, government or leaders decide or majority opinion is at that particular time. That's why there are laws. That's why we have things like the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. These are supposed to be things that are not subject to constant reassessment by elections. And so again, liberalism is about protecting individuals. It's about protecting individuals from power. It's about protecting individuals from governments. It's about protecting individuals, yes, from majorities when they may find themselves outside of the boundaries of, again, whatever the majority of the day is.
Now, I told you that we were going to be talking a little bit about what's going on college campuses, because a lot of this has been playing out on some of the campuses around who's invited to speak there, whose voices are heard there. And so I'm wondering, in your experience at Barnard and Columbia, and perhaps other campuses as well, how do you see that getting played out? And can you make an assessment or prediction about what are actually now, I guess, the age cohort in college students now are Gen Zs. Millennials are older. So can we be hopeful about that?
Well, I actually think that the three songs that were sung to initiate this meeting were really a great introduction to this topic. I mean, what's happened in American society over the past generation is it's gotten extremely polarized. I think that's probably a term everybody in this room has heard. And that polarization is very much reflected on college campuses, and maybe even somewhat deeper just because, you know, young people tend to be a little bit more idealistic even, and therefore perhaps somewhat more extreme in their views than, you know, sort of the older folks like ourselves, or rather, let me speak for myself. And so I think what you've seen with this polarization is a lack of acceptance of the legitimacy of the other, a lack of understanding of the other, a lack of an ability and perhaps even a willingness to talk to the other. And I think what we've seen is some reflection of this on college campuses, which is to say that people have a lot of trouble accepting not just the legitimacy of other opinions, but I think that we have lost to some degree the ability to speak to each other. I think the context within which comfortable or productive speech happens, that we have to recognize that those contexts are very particular, right? You can't just throw people in a room and hope that conversations will be productive and empathetic. It requires particular type of contexts. And I think we've lost that to some degree as a society over the past generation. And I think we've also unfortunately lost that a little bit on college campuses, precisely a place where these kinds of conversations are supposed to happen. And so again, I think to some degree what's happening on college campuses is a little bit of a reflection of what's happening in American society, which is a loss of an ability to engage in productive ways.
Right. I'm thinking about the song, you know, Please Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood. And I think we all struggle with that we don't want to be misunderstood, but we sometimes forget to embrace the empathy of that that we should also try not to misunderstand other people as well. So I'm wondering, what you were saying about that conversation, I think we need to have trained facilitators who can work in these settings, who can bring the stakeholders together and facilitate that conversation. But I'm also wondering how many people who are stakeholders would even come to that table. And is that an issue that you're finding, that there are some people who are willing to do that for the sake of democracy or liberalism, and others who just refuse to sit at the table and who are powerful stakeholders?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that's a great question. And again, I think that college campuses reflect or sort of mirror some larger tendencies in American society. What you often will see on college campuses, and again, I think it's very important to recognize that the college campuses that folks like us are most aware of, most familiar with, like the college campus I teach on, Barnard and Columbia, elite college campuses to some degree on the coast, really quite different in many ways from what's going on in other parts of the country. So I think it's important to say that as well. And much of what you hear in the news really focuses on the former, that is to say these campuses on the coast, because the people who write about the news, journalists, politicians, pundits, these people tend disproportionately to come from these campuses in those areas, and so what's going on there, I think, is much more in the foreground than might be the case, if you were to look at college campuses more generally. But that said, to get back to your question, the issue is that, as almost is always the case, both sides in this debate have very legitimate views and grievances, and it's very difficult to get people to see the other side. So on the one hand, you have folks who recognizably feel that many groups have been historically prevented from participating fully in the life of the campus, whose interests have not been given full credence in curriculum, in admissions, and all kinds of other things. And they feel very sensitive, therefore, about ensuring that they have a space at the table where they can feel comfortable and where they can get their concerns heard. On the other hand, you have folks who are like, look, I don't want to feel uncomfortable voicing things that I say for fear of being deplatformed, called out, insulted, things like that. And these are both, I have to say, legitimate viewpoints in the sense that I believe that both sides truly believe in these things and feel that they are being shut down in some way by the other side. And the only way really to get people to see the other side, not necessarily to agree with it, but to accept the legitimacy of the other side, is to bring people together, as you said, in ways where, again, they can confront each other without fear, without threat, without a sense that this is a zero-sum game. And given the polarization that exists on campuses, it's very hard to do that simply without, again, some kind of either facilitator or context whereby the rules are very clear about the kinds of conversations that can and should be had, and the kinds of interactions that enable or facilitate, again, if not convincing the other side, at least accepting the legitimacy of their right to speak.
So your book that's coming out soon looks at over 2 centuries of democracies. And at one point, it said, I believe you said, or the reviewer said, even the most virulently reactionary regimes could not suppress every element of democratic progress. So are you still seeing that? Are you still, after having, do you see a thread that goes through this that's, you did good.
So,
because I think I know for myself, and I think for many of my members, I'll speak for myself. I wake up in the morning, turn on New York 1, and go, oh God, what fresh hell is there today? So we're always looking, if not for the silver lining, at least for some kind of hope. And perhaps we got some of the hope in terms of numbers of people turning out, but as you know so well, in democracy, voting is only part of participating in a democracy. So we need to do much more than that. So can you speak to that hope and participation?
So those are great questions, and I think there's a lot of kind of contradictory things going on in the United States and in Western Europe today, and it's hard to figure out sort of how to make sense of them. I mean, On the one hand, what we have, particularly in this country, are very low rates of political participation. We hear most about voting rates, but actually political participation more generally, if you think about people who write to their representatives, who participate in civil society organizations like this one, who protest, these numbers actually are historically quite low. And in fact, what's really disturbing about them, right, you're the first song that you brought up was from the Women's March, is participation skews very, very heavily by socioeconomic and educational, that correlates very highly with socioeconomic status and educational attainment. So if you were to look at pictures, for instance, from the Women's March, it's kind of people like us, right? You think of protest as actually being a very general phenomenon. In fact, even protest is not. It is really disproportionately the actions of, again, the highly educated, those with, on the upper ends of the socioeconomic status spectrum. So one thing that we are seeing today, however, though, is that this kind of polarization does have a tendency to mobilize people. It may not be the healthiest kind of mobilization. People who are angry are very easily mobilized. But it is forcing people, right, to re-engage with the political process. Now, the question of whether or not that turns out to be something healthy for American democracy or not is still very much up to grabs. We've had periods like this in the American past, as I'm sure you're all aware of, right? The term populism, for instance, comes from late 19th century America, when we had a bunch of people who felt like they were losing out by changes in capitalism, farmers and others who felt like they were being left behind, that the government wasn't concerned about them, wasn't taking their interests seriously, and they formed a whole variety of movements called populist movements that, again, were claiming that, again, the voice of the people was not being heard, that government and leaders were not responsive to them. Now, over time, what happened basically was that the democratic system did actually respond. Slowly, but it did, right? A lot of these concerns, for instance, got integrated into the progressive movement and even later into Roosevelt's New Deal. We saw similar kinds of things in the 1960s, right? When people became extremely aware that American democracy was not actually fulfilling the hopes and the dreams of all its citizens, that lots of people had been left out of the promise of the American dream. And you saw a huge amount of mobilization. And again, not perfectly, but to some degree, the system adapted, right? The question we really face today is this gap between our ideals, right? The things that we say are part of our American democracy are in things like our Bill of Rights and the Constitution, right? And a reality that doesn't quite live up to those things, right? Is all of this mobilization that's happening, is all of this anger going to force our political system to adjust in ways, right, that bring the reality closer to the ideal, right? That's what one hopes is the result of this kind of, again, anger and mobilization. That has happened in the past, and one can hope that that's what's going to happen again today.
Now, you've mentioned the Constitution a few times, and so I'm wondering, since you've been looking at the history of democracy, if you included in that research the Haudenosaunee peace treaty, because in the 1980s, the Congress finally recognized the debt that was owed to them for that confederacy. So I know you're mostly dealing with Europe, but I mentioned before that we often celebrate the Wampanoag in lieu of replacing the traditional Thanksgiving that was an interesting narrative. So I'm just wondering if you had any perspective on that.
On
the Iroquois Confederacy and the Constitution.
So,
or if you're primarily interested in the European contribution to democracy.
So the book is about Europe. It's not so much about the European contribution, but about sort of how democracy and dictatorship develop in Europe. That said, I think one of the things that is important to note is that this sort of striving for self-rule, right? This is not something obviously that was limited to Europe or the United States. Obviously, as your question indicates, this is something that is kind of a universal aspiration, right? Okay, the desire to kind of be able to make the rules by which your society is governed. The community should have an opportunity to decide itself rather than having those decisions made by, whatever, sort of divine right or something else. So I think, yes, it is important to recognize that, again, this striving for self-rule, this is not something that's limited to certain societies or certain cultures at particular points in time. This is, I think, a sort of universal aspiration, although, again, I think what history does teach us is that there are times when that aspiration seems to conflict with others, right? And those are times when you see really immense political turmoil. When people feel like, okay, all things being equal, we would prefer self-rule, but perhaps in return for not ruling ourselves, we are going to be given something we value even more, right? Whatever that is, order, stability, economic growth. Those are times, again, when you begin to see an awful lot of political turmoil. But absolutely, the idea that democracy is something that, was born for the first time in the French Revolution or the American Revolution, no, that's not true.
So before I open it up for questions from our members and our people, our visitors, I'm wondering if you have what would be an ideal democracy. And one of the reasons I'm asking that is that I've been frustrated, I know other people have been frustrated by the Electoral College. We've been frustrated by gerrymandering. We've been frustrated to see that that the majority does not seem to be ruling in this country, and that for a number of reasons, and that those people who are living in a rural area, and I grew up in a rural area, so I'm appreciative of giving people who live in rural areas a voice. But we also know that, that sort of the values are in different places. So I'm just wondering, in your research and sort of just in your wondering, is there an ideal form of democracy? And should we be striving for that?
So that's a great question. The short answer is no. There is no ideal form of democracy. And I will say that political scientists spend a lot of time, obviously, thinking about these questions. And I just want to throw maybe some complicating ideas out there, because political science, we call ourselves political science, but we're not a science, because there is no easy answer. There is no one answer. You can't run experiments and figure out, how this variable X is going to influence that variable Y. But so let me just throw out a few points. There is no doubt, for instance, that the skew in institutions like the Senate and the Electoral College has gotten greater over the past generation, for a variety of reasons that have to do with partisan sorting, the way people have moved across the country geographically. That is to say that the undemocratic, anti-majoritarian aspects of things like the Electoral College and the Senate have gotten worse over the past generation. That said, this gets back, I think, a little bit to some of the questions you asked at the beginning, which is the reason these things were put in our Constitution was precisely to protect the rights of a minority. Now, that minority may be one that we at this point are not very sympathetic to, but the idea was that the United States was a compromise, right? It was a compromise between lots of groups with a lot of different interests, many of which I'm sure people in this room are not particularly sympathetic to. But that's kind of what democracy is all about, right? Which is, if everybody's interests were the same, if we all had the same opinions, democracy would be superfluous. Democracy is a system for diverse societies with lots of conflicts. And so there's no doubt that things like the Senate and the Electoral College are anti-majoritarian. But that is their point. And once you have rules of the game, the only legitimate way within a democracy to change them is by the rules of that game. Especially when you don't like them, because you can't just decide that democracy is only okay when it works for you, because then you're not really a Democrat at all, small d, Democrat. Now, that said, political scientists also know that, again, a lot of these anti-majoritarian aspects of the American system have indeed gotten worse over the past generation. Gerrymandering, voter suppression, the role of money in politics has in fact changed. Not only in the sense that there's more money in politics, but we now know from our research that that very much skews policy making, agenda setting, who runs for office, what types of voices are heard by politicians. So there's simply no doubt that there has been a systematic and very troubling shift in the responsiveness of American democracy over the past generation. That said, the point of democracy is you must accept the rules of the game even if they don't work in your favor. And so the only democratic way of changing those things is by working within the democratic system to do so. And so that means, again, getting back to some of the things that were said right at the beginning, and I think that is sort of inherent in this particular group of people, activism, right? If you don't like the rules of the game, then you get involved and you try to elect people who can change them. Things like gerrymandering, for instance, are largely the consequence of the fact that the Democratic Party, for instance, collapsed in many parts of the United States. You know, if you're not there and somebody else skews the rules, well, the way to change that is by getting yourself back in power. Same thing with things like changing voting rules. That's why you have to have at least 2 viable parties so that, you know, people without constraints do bad things. That's why we have laws. And so when you put Republicans in charge of a state and they have no opposition, they're going to do things that probably are going to skew the game in their favor. And as bad as that is, right, the way to check that is by making sure that, again, there's somebody there to check them. And so, again, I think what's really important is that we think about our democracy as something above the particular outcomes of the day, and that we have to play within the democratic rules of the game if we want to change them. Otherwise, we won't have a democracy for very long anymore.
Thank you. Oh, any questions? Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I have a question. I think I heard a mixed message. We have to give a voice to the other, whatever the other may be. Yet I heard you say something about if the majority is in power, then we have to go with the majority. Now, how can both of those 2 things exist?
So that's a great question. I mean, in a democracy, right, and especially in a democracy like the United States, we have lots of different levels and levers of power. And so if you feel like, again, maybe democracy is not working for your team, let's say, or for your interests, then what you need to do is figure out, okay, look, how am I going to win elections, whatever, at the local, the state, or the national level? There's no reason why that can't happen. I mean, whatever you may think of Donald Trump, the rules of the game have not become so skewed that we are unable to participate, we are unable to elect candidates. If you feel like, again, the system is not working as it should be, then you should be, not you, but one should be out there trying to figure out how to capture different levers of power. So right now, for instance, we have a president, right, who was not elected by a majority of voters, but was elected by the rules of the game. So there's 2 different ways to deal with that if you think that that's wrong. One is you work next time to make sure that a candidate is elected, you know, who can get a majority by the rules of the game. The second is you can think about over the long term how to change those rules in ways that are consistent with democracy and reflect, again, you know, a sort of fairer system. So that would be things like, again, changing laws. There were lots of referenda, for instance, in this last election about putting in place nonpartisan districting commissions to avoid things like gerrymanders. Democrats started and should be running on things like making sure that the rules of the game for voting are both easier and more transparent. These are all things that our political system allows you to do, and that unfortunately only until recently, because the system has gotten very skewed to favor one party as opposed to another, that people were not running on, were not focusing on. But that can be done. It started to be done in this last election, and hopefully will continue to be done. Because these are nonpartisan kinds of things, right? These are, you know, fair districting, fair voting. I think most people recognize this to be sort of, you know, a part of democracy that supersedes partisanship.
Any questions?
Yeah, so my question is if you could address education and media also, because I have the sense that when people are voting, it's not like they all generically represent something. They're influenced by the education system, what is their political consciousness, what's the media broadcasting, or which media, et cetera.
So, I mean, this is a big question that political scientists and a lot of other people have been thinking about, right? Which is to say that the nature of information flows, what we consider to be the press, has changed dramatically over the last generation. And I think people are, again, begun to recognize that a lot of these changes haven't been fully, the consequences of these changes for democracy, for American society, have not been fully thought through. So there was a time, probably most of us, maybe not some of the folks in the back, can remember when, your news sources were really fairly limited. Now, the advantage of that was that most people got their news from the same kind of place. And there was an extensive network of local news, both at the TV and in newspapers, that provided communities with an opportunity to find out about what was going on in the community and to interact, so to speak, at a kind of local level. The media landscape has changed dramatically, right? And the good side of that is that actually you can hear many more voices now than you could have in the past, right? People whose voices would never have been heard now have a platform for that. That's good. The disadvantage is, right, that people now very much select, we know this based on a huge amount of research, very much select often the news sources that they consume based on pre-existing views. And so rather than getting information from sort of diverse perspectives, people have a tendency more now than they could have in the past to select information that simply supports their pre-existing views. Right? This is what people call sort of siloization or something like that. This is not good for democracy. So again, we have these kind of conflicting things going on. On the one hand, many more voices are heard than were in the past. That's good. Right? On the other hand, you can select out in a way that would have been much more difficult in the past. I think as a society and as a democracy, what we're beginning to recognize is that, again, we have to think carefully about these trends and what, if anything, government should be doing about them. I don't want to speak too long on this, but I will say one interesting point to keep in mind, right, which is, things like the internet, Facebook, Google, all these things that you all know about, right? These are relatively new types of technologies, right? 20 years after cars became, sort of a mass product, we did not have things like rules of the road, safety belt regulations, things like that. It takes a long time for government to catch up. I think what we're beginning to see now is a sense that the public interest may very well be negatively affected by some of these new technologies, and that governments probably need to intervene in some way, but we're not quite sure how yet. But I think that conversation, again, we've seen beginning to happen over the last couple of years.
Okay, wow. I think we have time for a couple more. Yes, sir. Question?
I would appreciate it if you would address the very difficult and specific topic of your conversation today, which is free speech versus hate speech. Does not the concept of free speech mean that if I hate something, I can say I hate it? If I hate a group, I can say I hate them, as long as I do not advocate violence against them?
So that is one way of thinking about free speech, right? Which is free speech regardless of what is being said, again, with the caveat that you may not incite violence because that stops speech from happening. So I think that is, a good definition of free speech. The question that's being debated on college campuses, and I think, again, to some degree reflective of sort of larger debates in society, right, is how do you balance that with making sure that groups that have felt excluded from the conversation don't feel so excluded that they can't participate as well? I think that, again, probably what you see on elite college campuses on the coast is a little bit more swing towards limiting free speech to protect groups that feel like their rights are being injured by it. I think that is less true in other parts of the country. Again, I think this debate has been rekindled to some degree by the election of Trump, particularly by the sense that college campuses on the coast are more intellectually homogenous than may very well be healthy, and therefore thinking about how to encourage speech from different perspectives without making groups feel like they can't participate, this is something that needs to be discussed again. So I think this conversation is being reopened with a recognition that, again, the balance between these things needs to perhaps be, again, discussed further.
And one last question from Steve.
We're good.
You're good? Okay, great. Over here? Oh, this gentleman here, I don't know your name.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to ask about the democratic socialism, this new wave, and particularly out there about Cortez, because she represents a lot of us here. And I just happened to, when I looked you up and I saw you were speaking, I saw you wrote an article shortly after she won her primary.
Yeah.
And you talk about how democratic socialism isn't necessarily compatible with democracy in history. I'm just wondering if you could expand upon that a little bit, because she's a big topic right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think she is probably a somewhat, sort of pragmatic politician with views that skew somewhat to the left of where the Democratic Party has been. And again, I think that that's probably a healthy development in the sense that, she represents a district where those kinds of views can win her an election. Actually, it's from a district very close to where I grew up. But, and so I think that, her views, even though she calls herself a democratic socialist, partially because we've not had a strong democratic socialist tradition in the United States, probably don't fit perfectly well with what democratic socialism historically has meant in a place like Europe. I think that if you look at the polls, for instance, today, if you poll young people, maybe folks around your age, right, and you ask them, do you support socialism? A surprisingly large number do. But then when you ask them, what do you mean by socialism? The views are everywhere. Partially, again, I think because we don't have a tradition in the United States that we can look to and say, okay, this is what socialism means. The plurality viewpoint around democratic socialism tends to be things like an expanded welfare state, health care for all, more liberal policies towards immigration. In Europe, those would not be socialist positions. They're pretty standard, social democratic ones. And so, again, I think that in the United States, what she probably represents is a little bit more of that view of socialism. There are, however, people within organizations like the DSA, mostly intellectuals, perhaps like myself, who think of socialism in a much more stringent way. It means essentially sort of the end of capitalism, or extreme limits on private property. Those kind of views historically have had some real potential conflict with democracy, not only because once you start concentrating economic power in the hands of the government, all kinds of problems happen, but because you always then run into the question of, well, suppose, to get back to the original topics that we talked about, suppose the majority doesn't agree with me. Right? Suppose the majority doesn't want to vote for these kinds of policies. Which is more important to me, right? That I accept the outcomes of democratic elections, or that I move around democracy to achieve these other more fundamental goals. Historically, that's the kind of dilemma that democratic socialists in the, again, European sense have faced, right? If people aren't going to vote for my policies around things like ending capitalism, what does that mean? Do I throw those policies away and stick with democracy? Or do I do an end game around democracy in order to get those policies? I don't think Ocasio-Cortez is there. I think she's a left-wing politician from a left-wing district who wants to push the United States in a somewhat more progressive position. But, if we get to the point where some of the more, again, extreme versions of democratic socialism become dominant, either within DSA or in the Democratic Party, which I seriously doubt will happen, I think some of those questions will become more live. But right now, probably not.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.